Nephilim Descendants, Biblical Giants, and Goliath's Dark Legacy. For centuries, whispers of giants have lingered in the shadows of ancient texts, beings born of the Nephilim bloodline, towering figures who dared to challenge both men and God himself. These accounts do not read like bedtime tales for children, but rather like fragments of a forbidden history, echoes of a reality that unsettles everything we think we know about creation. They stand at the trembling edge of theology and philosophy, raising questions the modern mind hesitates to ask. What is the true essence of humanity? Where does the mortal end and the divine begin? And why does Scripture speak of beings so vast and terrible that even kings trembled at their sight? The giants of biblical lore are not merely characters locked in myth. They are symbols of a cosmic drama, reminders of humanity's most fragile vulnerabilities. To confront their legacy is to confront the disturbing possibility that our world has been touched by powers we cannot comprehend, forces that may not have disappeared, but that may still cast their shadow across history, and perhaps even into our present. If this story stirs something within you, an unease, a curiosity, a hunger for truth, then I invite you to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join the conversation. Your voice matters here, and together we will explore the mysteries most feared to touch. The forbidden origins of the Nephilim bloodline. The Nephilim appear in Scripture with such brevity that their presence feels almost like a forbidden shadow, a dangerous truth hidden behind words too fragile to contain it. In Genesis 6, the passage is abrupt, unsettling. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them as wives. From this union, we are told, came the Nephilim. But what does this mean? Who were these sons of Keed? The text does not elaborate, and in its silence lies a haunting suggestion. Were they angels fallen from heaven? Rebels who abandoned their divine estate to indulge in earthly desire? Were they celestial beings who defied the natural boundaries of creation? Or were they something even darker, forces not meant to touch the soil of this world, now merging with humanity in ways that tainted the very fabric of existence? The uncertainty is not comforting. It opens before us a chasm of questions, each more disturbing than the last, and whispers that the Nephilim were never meant to be understood within human categories at all. They were not mere mortals, they were hybrids, half-breeds of rebellion, an echo of heaven's defiance rooted in the flesh of earth. And if humanity was created in the image of God, then in what image were they made? Perhaps they were the distortion of the divine image itself, the grotesque mirror that reflects not the perfection of creation, but its corruption, not harmony, but fracture, not obedience, but trespass. It is telling that Scripture moves quickly past them, as if their very mention is perilous. Genesis speaks of them and then turns away, as if unwilling to stare too long at a truth too monstrous for sustained attention. This silence is not accidental. Ancient commentators often suggested that their legacy was deliberately obscured because to dwell upon it was to invite instability, to summon questions too vast for the human heart. To speak openly of the Nephilim was to admit that the natural order had been violated in ways that shattered the foundations of creation. They were the evidence of boundaries crossed, of cosmic law broken, of heaven and earth entangled in forbidden union. And so their story was not preserved in full detail, but left as fragments, hints, whispers, because to tell it plainly would destabilize the fragile architecture of human faith. The flood itself may be seen as God's desperate intervention, not merely to punish human corruption, but to erase a tainted bloodline, to scour the soil of a hybrid presence that threatened all creation. Those waters did more than drown, they washed away memory. They served as erasure, an attempt to blot out the very knowledge of what had once walked among men. The flood was as much about cleansing history as it was about cleansing the earth. And yet, memory is stubborn. Though Scripture turned its gaze away, other writings dared to linger. The Book of Enoch, buried for centuries and rediscovered in fragments, dares to describe the giants in greater detail. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed in the caves of Qumran, carry faint echoes of their presence. In these texts, the Nephilim are not described as noble or heroic. They are painted as monsters of staggering size, beings whose greed consumed the world around them. They devoured crops and animals until nothing remained, And when famine came, they turned upon mankind itself. Their violence was not that of soldiers, but of predators. Their arrogance was not simply pride, but cosmic defiance, as though rebellion itself had been incarnated in flesh. They were the children of heaven's trespass, the proof that even divine beings could corrupt creation when they abandoned their appointed place. And because they were born of that trespass, they lived not as stewards of the earth, but as destroyers of it. Their size was not glory, but curse. Their strength not blessing, but poison. For the modern reader, these accounts may appear fantastical, the material of legend, no more credible than the myths of titans or Olympian gods. But within the ancient world, these were not mere stories, they were warning songs. The Nephilim were remembered not to entertain, but to caution, not to glorify, but to terrify. They stood as the symbols of what happens when sacred boundaries collapse, when divine order is ignored, when creation itself is twisted into forms that violate its design. They are not simply figures of the past. They are the embodiment of a possibility that remains hauntingly near. They remind us that the human story is fragile, that the order of the world is not as invulnerable as we think. They are the nightmare version of humanity, the possibility of what man might become when joined to rebellion rather than obedience. Philosophically, the Nephilim force us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. If creation itself can be corrupted, if divine law can be violated so profoundly, then what does that say about the stability of existence? If the flood was meant to erase them, why does Scripture confess in a quiet, unsettling line that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward? What does it mean that their presence endured, that their shadow remained even after the waters receded? Are they gone forever, or do they linger still, hidden within memory, bloodlines, or spirits that cannot die? To speak of them is to open a door we may not be prepared to walk through, for it forces us to confront not just the monsters of the past, but the potential of their return. The Nephilim, then, are not merely ancient giants to be cataloged in myth. They are reminders of a truth far more unsettling. That creation is not immune to corruption, that humanity is not the only actor upon the stage of earth, and that rebellion against God's design can take forms more horrifying than we dare imagine. Their story is brief, but its brevity is its own kind of power. It is as if Scripture itself says, "Look, but do not look too long. Remember, but do not remember too clearly." The Nephilim are a fragment, a scar in the text of history, a shadow preserved just enough to remind us that the boundaries of heaven and earth can be crossed, and that when they are, the result is not glory, but monstrosity. To dwell on them is to acknowledge the fragility of our world, the precariousness of our own existence, and the possibility that forbidden unions still haunt creation. And perhaps that is why their story remains whispered rather than shouted, because it is less a tale of the past than a warning of what might come again. Giants among men, the chilling truth behind biblical titans. The giants of Scripture stand not as fables, but as living shadows over human history, terrifying remnants of a world we scarcely understand. If the Nephilim were indeed born of a forbidden union, then their very existence was a monument to rebellion, a blasphemy carved in flesh. They were not simply tall men, as modern rationalists dismissively suggest, but titans, colossal figures who bent the world beneath their weight and defied the boundaries of creation itself. Scripture offers only fragments, but every fragment lands like a hammer blow. In Numbers 13, the Israelite spies returned from Canaan trembling, their voices heavy with dread. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. What sort of being must tower so dreadfully above the human frame that warriors hardened by wilderness, men accustomed to danger, could only describe themselves as insects in comparison? That is not the language of exaggeration. That is the language of terror. It is not poetry, but the voice of eyewitnesses, men reduced to shadows beneath presences too vast to comprehend. The chilling truth, hidden beneath centuries of theological restraint, is that the ancient world knew of these beings. Israel was not alone in its memory. Across the globe, cultures whispered of titans, colossal ancestors, beings who once walked the earth with strides that shook mountains. The Greeks spoke of the Titans, primordial giants who fought the gods themselves. The Mesopotamians recorded the Anunnaki, otherworldly figures of terrifying stature. Even the stones cry out. From the megalithic ruins of South America to the ancient walls of Baalbek in Lebanon, where single stones weighing hundreds of tons lie in perfect placement, there exists a silent testimony to hands far greater than ours. Who could have moved such masses with primitive tools? Who could have designed such staggering works before the age of cranes, engines, or steel? The mythic answer is unsettling. Giants. Not metaphorical ones, not allegorical constructs, but literal beings whose strength dwarfed mankind's greatest efforts. Archaeological anomalies deepen the unease. Reports from centuries past speak of skeletons of unnatural size unearthed from the soil, skulls with elongations and proportions that defy the normal scale of humanity. Though many such finds are suppressed, dismissed, or lost to time, the persistence of these stories reflects a human memory that refuses to be erased. Our myths, our ruins, even our bones all whisper in chorus, there was once something here greater, darker, and more terrible than us. But the terror of the giants was not confined to their sheer physical scale. The Book of Enoch, that forbidden text preserved by hidden hands, paints a portrait of hunger so insatiable that the earth itself groaned beneath it. The giants consumed the crops of men until the fields lay bare. They devoured the flocks and herds until livestock vanished. And when famine came, they turned upon mankind itself, feasting on the very ones whose mothers had borne them. This was not the tale of misunderstood outsiders, nor of noble savages who lived in harmony with creation. It was predation, unholy, unrelenting, and monstrous. The Nephilim were not protectors of humanity, but tormentors. Not guardians, but oppressors. They were shadows of power unleashed when heaven's rebellion corrupted Earth's womb. What does this mean for us today? If the giants were real, if they strode across the soil of our ancestors, then human history is not what we are taught in the sterile pages of textbooks. It is not the neat, linear story of progress and evolution. It is a fractured saga haunted by intrusions from beyond, a drama in which mankind has always been vulnerable to forces greater and darker than we wish to admit. Our temples and monuments may speak of glory, but our myths, our warnings, and our ruins speak of terror. They tell us that humanity has never stood alone. Philosophically, the giants stand as incarnations of hubris itself. They are what happens when the natural order is pushed beyond its limits, when heaven and earth merge in violation rather than harmony. They are the embodiment of excess, the distortion of creation into grotesque extremes. They remind us that existence is not neutral, but charged with moral consequence. Creation itself carries boundaries, and when those boundaries are transgressed, monstrosity is born. The Nephilim were not accidents of biology, but symbols of rebellion made flesh. They were not chance mutations, but cosmic warnings. And like all rebellion, their story did not vanish with their bodies. It carved scars into history, scars that linger in myths retold across cultures, in ruins we cannot explain, and perhaps even in bloodlines that survive, unseen, among us. To contemplate the giants is to confront the fragility of humanity. We are not the first to walk this earth in power, nor the only beings to leave their mark upon it. The giants remind us of what creation becomes when it is bent by rebellion. Life twisted into horror, strength warped into oppression, stature transformed into tyranny. They force us to ask whether the shadows of that ancient rebellion still walk among us. Are the giants gone, or do they still whisper through our stories, our ruins, and our fears? Perhaps they are not entirely of the past. Perhaps their memory persists because their legacy has not fully died. And if that is so, then the human story is not merely our own. It is a story we share with beings who stood as monuments to cosmic trespass, beings who taught us in their terror what it means when sacred boundaries are shattered. David versus Goliath more than a children's story? The story of David and Goliath is repeated so often in Western culture that it has become shorthand for any struggle between the weak and the strong. We teach it to children as a parable of courage, a tale where faith and cleverness can topple brute force. But to reduce it to a simple moral anecdote is to strip it of its thunder, to silence the cosmic reverberations that echo behind the battle. For Goliath was no ordinary warrior, and David no ordinary boy. The confrontation between them was not merely about military bravery, it was about the collision of two orders of existence, two legacies that stretched back to the dawn of creation. Scripture spares no detail in describing the immensity of Goliath. 6 cubits and a span in height, nearly 10 feet tall, clad in bronze so heavy that it alone would crush the average man. He strode into the valley not merely as a soldier, but as a living monument of terror, the embodiment of everything Israel's armies could not face. His presence reduced the courage of hardened fighters into silence, for he seemed not like a man but like a fortress of flesh, an immovable wall of iron and sinew. Yet Goliath was more than a champion of Philistia. He was a remnant of the Nephilim, a living echo of the forbidden bloodline that Israel's ancestors had once feared when they spied the land of Canaan. He was not just a warrior, he was a survivor of a rebellion that should have been drowned in the flood, a genetic memory of trespass against the divine order. When he mocked Israel, he carried not just human arrogance, but the shadow of cosmic defiance. Thus, when David stepped forward, sling in hand, it was not merely a boy daring to face a soldier, it was covenant confronting corruption, divine promise standing against the remnants of forbidden creation. His act was not only one of courage, it was one of theology, of cosmic declaration. The victory of David was not the triumph of an underdog who outsmarted a stronger opponent, but the revelation that the Nephilim line, for all its height and terror, could not endure against the living God. The battlefield in that valley was not simply soil and stone, it was a stage for heaven's verdict upon a bloodline of rebellion. David's stone was more than a weapon. It was an interruption from God himself, a rupture in history that declared the giants, however mighty, would not prevail forever. Philosophically, the story carries weight far deeper than the moral of courage. It is about the clash between two modes of being. On one side stood a giant whose very body testified to a cosmic trespass, a violation of creation's order that loomed as both physical terror and spiritual blasphemy. On the other stood a boy whose only weapon was not his strength, but his faith that God himself would vindicate the covenant and crush the rebellion still walking in Goliath's frame. The battle was not fair, nor was it meant to be. It was a divine drama in which the destiny of a people and the meaning of humanity itself hung in the balance. For if Goliath had prevailed, it would have been more than a military loss. It would have been the vindication of a cursed bloodline, the triumph of defiance against divine order. But David's victory proclaimed the opposite, that however terrifying, however armored, however ancient rebellion may be, it cannot stand forever. And yet, even in his death, Goliath looms larger than life. His figure in Scripture is unsettling, preserved in detail with his exact height, his armor, his taunts. Why such specificity? Why such deliberate attention? Perhaps because the text does not want us to forget that the giants still walk the earth, even after the flood, even after centuries of supposed cleansing. Goliath is remembered not only as a defeated enemy, but as a warning. The Nephilim bloodline had not been erased. The shadow of rebellion was still with Israel, still waiting to rise, still mocking covenant faith with his towering presence. His fall is a moment of triumph, yes, but also a haunting reminder that the struggle against corruption is not yet over. For the American reader, this story resonates with a peculiar clarity. Deep within us, we sense that evil is not always abstract. It takes form. It towers above us. It mocks us with its size and dares us to bow. Goliath is every tyrant, every empire, every system of oppression that seems too vast to topple. He is every shadow that looms so large we shrink into grasshoppers in our own sight. And yet, the deeper truth is darker still. Goliath is not merely a metaphor for the challenges of life. He was flesh and blood, a remnant of an ancient legacy that Scripture tries again and again to warn us about. His existence forces us to admit that the giants of old were not myths spun for children, but realities that demanded divine intervention to defeat. And so, David's stone was more than a clever shot, it was a cosmic proclamation. It declared that corruption, however ancient, however armored, however seemingly invincible, cannot endure forever. The clash between David and Goliath is not merely the story of a boy's bravery, but the story of humanity's fragile hope against forces that should have consumed it. In that trembling valley, the world saw that giants can fall, not because of human strength, but because God himself intervenes. The lesson is not that the weak can outwit the strong, but that rebellion, however massive, must one day face divine judgment. In that truth lies both comfort and terror. Comfort because we know that even the greatest shadows cannot last forever. Terror because the story itself reminds us that such shadows are real, that they have walked among us before, and that the struggle against them is not over. David's stone echoes across time, not simply as a victory for Israel, but as a declaration for all ages. The giants of old were real, and their downfall required nothing less than the hand of God. The dark legacy, are Nephilim descendants still walking among us? The scriptures tell us that the flood was more than water, it was judgment, an unmaking of creation so that creation might be born anew. It was heaven's cleansing, a cosmic reset meant to drown rebellion and silence the voices of corruption that had spread across the earth. Yet even in this act of divine erasure, a chilling verse remains, tucked like a thorn in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That final phrase, and also afterward, echoes like a riddle across the ages, unsettling scholars, theologians, and seekers alike. For if the flood was meant to annihilate the giants, then why does the text itself admit they returned? How could a bloodline so cursed survive annihilation? Did remnants escape through the wives of Noah's sons, smuggling the taint of corruption into the new world? Did the fallen beings return once more, drawn again to the daughters of men in defiance of God's command? Or is it possible that humanity itself bore within its veins the trace of that forbidden union, a lingering poison that could not be washed away even by the deluge? Whatever the answer, the conclusion is chilling. The giants rose again. Goliath stood as living proof, as did the sons of Anak, reminders that rebellion does not vanish with water, that shadows have a way of enduring even when history is rewritten. And yet the question gnaws deeper. Does it end there? Are the Nephilim merely relics of ancient times, or do they still linger, unseen yet present, haunting the fabric of our world? If the bloodline survived the flood, then what of today? Can we say with confidence that the giants are gone forever? That the earth has been freed of their presence? Or do they still hide in the tapestry of humanity, resurfacing in ways that defy rational explanation, shaping history in shadows while remaining unnamed? Whispers of their persistence echo through forbidden texts and esoteric traditions, voices that refuse to be silenced. The Book of Enoch describes how the spirits of the slain giants became wandering entities, cursed and restless, unable to ascend to heaven yet unable to perish fully. Some interpret this as the origin of demons, the dark offspring of rebellion, spirits forever chained to earth, hungry for influence, feeding upon the weakness of men. If this is true, then the Nephilim never truly left us. Their physical bodies were broken, but their essence survived, pressing against the edges of human history, stirring chaos, inciting violence, whispering temptations, and urging mankind once again to cross boundaries forbidden by God. They may not stride across the earth as colossal forms of flesh, but their shadow remains etched into the spiritual landscape of humanity, an ancient corruption that refuses to die. Nor is Scripture alone in its memory. Ancient cultures beyond Israel carried traditions of bloodlines touched by gods, of kings who claimed descent from otherworldly beings, of rulers whose might was greater than human, whose arrogance exceeded even that of empires. In these myths, one can trace the faint outline of the Nephilim, clothed in the language of culture but marked by the same dark signature, beings greater than men, but not of God. Whether they are called titans, Anunnaki, or demigods, the motif repeats across civilizations, a hybrid presence that disturbs the order of creation and claims dominion not given to it by heaven. Even in modern times, fascination with the Nephilim refuses to fade. Conspiracy theorists, researchers, and seekers speak of hidden evidence, elongated skulls unearthed in Peru, bones measuring far beyond human scale, artifacts reportedly confiscated or locked away. Skeptics dismiss these claims as fabrications, exaggerations, or simple errors. Yet the persistence of such stories across centuries reveals something deeper than scientific error. It reveals humanity's intuition that the giants may not be gone, that the shadow still lingers, that somewhere in blood or in spirit, the Nephilim remain. Perhaps not towering as flesh and bone, but towering as ideology, as power structures, as the kind of corruption that mocks faith and demands submission. Goliath may not stride across our valleys today, but his likeness towers in systems that oppress, in arrogance that devours, in forces that seem invincible until they are struck by the stone of faith. Philosophically, the legacy of the Nephilim is about far more than physical giants. It is about corruption, about what happens when humanity reaches for forbidden power. Their story forces us to wrestle with the reality that rebellion is not only biological but spiritual, not only ancient but present. The Nephilim rise every time humanity abandons humility and embraces arrogance, every time we exalt ourselves as guanes and consume creation without mercy. They live again whenever power is twisted into oppression, whenever strength is worshipped without restraint, whenever humanity imitates the giants by devouring rather than nurturing. In this sense, the Nephilim are not gone at all. They are resurrected every time we stray too far from the divine image. They are the eternal caution, a reminder of what mankind becomes when it no longer reflects the Creator, but imitates rebellion. And yet, for all the philosophical depth, there remains the eerie, visceral possibility that the bloodline still courses somewhere in the veins of this world. If true, then history is not finished with the giants. They are not relics of the past, but harbingers of future conflict. The story may not be over, and humanity may once again stand, as David did, before forces that appear invincible, before shadows that demand to be worshipped, before corruption that towers too high for us to scale. This is the dark legacy, a warning veiled in mystery, a shadow stretching from Genesis to the present day. To ask if the Nephilim walk among us is not only to ask whether giants of flesh still breathe, but to ask whether rebellion itself is alive, moving, whispering, waiting. They are not merely myths, they are mirrors, showing us what humanity can become when it abandons its covenant, when it forgets the sacred boundaries of creation. And perhaps, just perhaps, they are closer than we dare believe.